Greetings, everyone. My name is Emmanuel, and I would like to welcome you to today's live broadcast. Every week, we organize two programs. On Mondays, like today, we talk about politics and Christianity. And on Fridays, we talk about the meaning and significance of the kingdom gospel. So today I have an interesting topic that I began last Monday to talk about the separation of powers and checks and balances. But today we are going to look at it from a different angle. How countries in Africa can fight corruption through the doctrine of the separation of powers and checks and balances. Fighting corruption through the doctrine of the separation of powers and checks and balances. Some of you might be asking, who are not familiar with some of these terminologies, I would refer you to the previous video that I did. You can go on my YouTube channel and watch that video in order to have a better understanding of what I'm going to discuss today. But in a summary form, I would say that the doctrine of the separation of powers and checks and balances still teaches us that, governments around the world, because they are democratic governments, they have three separate branches of government. You have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch that is headed by the president, and you have the judicial branch. So these are the three branches of government in, I believe, almost all the countries that we have in the world. Governments are separated into these three branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So this is how most countries are organized. And even Africa also, this is how some of our constitutions are also organized. So the idea, like I discussed in my last video, of the separation of powers and checks and balances, this idea is rooted in the Bible. Like I said, the separation of powers and checks and balances was coined by the French social and political philosopher Montesquieu. He was a jurist, so he coined the phrase. But this idea is also found in the Bible. And even he himself, Montesquieu, traveled a lot, studied other governments and in other countries, and then came up with this idea of the separation of powers. You see, when God created man and placed him in the garden, God gave him a kingdom. What is a kingdom? A kingdom is a government headed by a king. You see, man was created by God, and God ruled over man. So that was and is the original idea of God. God wants to rule the world, and God rules the world. But unfortunately, Adam and Eve sinned against God. They rebelled against God. So they came out. They were not under the authority and rule of God because they sinned against God. So when they sinned against God, the devil became the god of this world. See, the devil has his own kingdom, which is called the kingdom of the devil. He rules over his kingdom. And according to the eternal plan of God, Jesus was to come and establish the physical kingdom of God. What is a kingdom? A kingdom is a state of government headed by a king. So Jesus, the seed of David, is a king. So God, in the form of Jesus, came to establish his kingdom on earth with Jerusalem as the capital. But when he came, Jesus, his people rejected him. They arrested him, tried him, and crucified him. But on the third day, Jesus rose again from the dead. And the Bible tells us that he was crowned both Lord and King. So Jesus sits at the right hand of God the Father. He's our high priest, but he rules. The Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul was defining for us the gospel, that Jesus rules until all enemies of God are subdued, and the last enemy is death. So Jesus is a king. You see, the plan of God is that God is the eternal king and he rules over all of creation. Daniel 4:17 tells us that God rules in the affairs of men. He intervenes in the affairs of men. Why? Because God has a plan. And the plan of God is going to come to pass whether man likes it or not. So God is the eternal king. And Jesus is also a king. So as a king, God has absolute authority, absolute power, absolute authority. And we also know that Jesus, because he is a king, he also has absolute authority. So when you read Isaiah 33 verse 24, it tells us that Jesus, or God, is a judge. He's a king and he's Lord. So these are powers that are in God. Why? Because God is holy, God is just. So all of these powers are concentrated in God. In the New Testament, the Bible tells us that when Jesus resurrected and he was crowned both Lord and King, all power in heaven and on earth was given to Jesus. So Jesus came and told his disciples. So we see that in Jesus as well, all power has been given to Jesus. So Jesus is a monarch. Jesus is a king. He's the seed of David. One day he's going to sit on the throne of David and rule the whole world from Jerusalem. Even though that has not yet happened, it's going to happen in the future, it's a future event. Jesus is still a king and he reigns in heaven until all his enemies are put under his feet. So the idea is that God is a king and all power is in God. And Jesus is a king as well and he has all power. He's a monarch. He has absolute power in his kingdom. So we as Christians who are in the kingdom of God, Jesus reigns and rules as the king. He has absolute authority and we submit under his authority. What he tells us is what we must do. Why? Because he is a king. So the doctrine of the separation of powers is that God has absolute authority because he's just, he is holy, and he distributes justice fairly, equally. In him there is no variableness. God does not favor people. God does not do favoritism. That is why all the powers are vested in God. But now, because God is the one who created man, and because man, remember, Adam and Eve, they rejected God in the garden. But when God chose Abraham and his children went into captivity in Egypt, and when they came out of Egypt, they built the tabernacle, and God came down and dwelt amongst his people. So the desire of God is always to live among his people. So God wants to rule us. But unfortunately, when the children of Israel, journeyed through the wilderness and they got into the promised land, a time came when the people came to their leader, Samuel, and said, they want a king like the other pagan nations around them. Samuel rejected the idea, and Samuel went back to God and said, God, look at what these people are saying. God said Samuel should choose a king for them. That Samuel is not the one who is the problem, but the people have rejected God. See, God was the ruler of the children of Israel, but the people rejected the rule of God in favor of the rule of man. Are you understanding this, my dear brothers and sisters? So before even they came into the promised land, God had already given them, some rules concerning their king, because God knew that when they enter the promised land, they are going to look for a king like the other nations around them. So God told them that these are the conditions. This is what is going to happen if you choose a king. He's going to tax you people. He's going to oppress you people. He's going to exploit you people. But the Jewish people, they did not listen. That is found in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14 to around 17. So when they got to the promised land, they did the same thing. The people rejected the rule of God. Remember, the kingdom is the rule of God, and they wanted their own king. And Samuel was not happy about that. He went to God, and God said, okay, let them have a king. And God instructed Samuel to anoint Saul. So Saul became the first king of Israel. The people rejected God and they wanted a physical king, so God gave them Saul. So the point I'm trying to make is that God divided the powers into three. He gave it to three different people. The idea of the separation of powers, how we can use that idea in Africa to fight corruption, is what we are talking about today. So Samuel was a prophet. He was not a king. So God chose a different person to be a king. And subsequently, God also chose a different person to be the high priest. See, so the powers were divided. God did not allow one person to hold all the offices. The offices of a king, the offices of a priest, the office of a priest, and the office of a prophet. Because God knows man. He created us. He knows us. He knows what we can do. He knows our ability. He knows our desires. That man is prone to evil. The heart of man is wicked. So God did not want man to hold all the three offices. So he divided it. With God, God holds all the three offices. Remember? He is Lord, he is judge, he is king. But when it comes to man, God does not want man to hold all the three offices. That is why God divided the three offices. That is what we call separation of powers. Samuel was the prophet. Saul was the king. And then you had another person who was the high priest. So these powers were divided because man is prone to wickedness. So most of the leaders of nations, like people like John Locke, who were philosophers, they saw this idea in the Bible, and when they were writing their treatise, they included it, but they used secular language, to express the idea. Remember, John Locke was a Puritan, he was a Christian. So he understood from reading the Bible this idea of the separation of powers. So even though Montesquieu, the French jurist and philosopher, was the one who coined the phrase, Montesquieu, learned some of these ideas from John Locke and from his different travels that he did. So God is the one who created government. This is something that Christians don't know. They think that God only started the church, and all our attention is just the church tithes and offering. That's what people talk about all the time. But they don't understand that God is the one who created governments, and God is the one who created nations. So God is a king. He knows how governments work. He knows how nations ought to, carry out their activities. So, in dealing with man, God said that no one man should have all the three offices. So, these three offices were divided among three different people. So, this secular philosopher or these philosophers saw this idea in the Bible and incorporated it in their treatise. So we as Africans, what is happening in our different nations? In our different nations, there is no, even though in our constitutions, they talk about the separation of powers. But the fact is, these powers are not independent of each other. That's where we talk about the separation of powers and then checks and balances. You see, in most African countries, our presidents have absolute authority. If they are not happy with somebody, they can tell the military guys or the police, to go arrest that person. And you can be locked up for nothing. And there's nothing you can do. Your lawyers can go to court and fight. And after that, maybe you are released. That's the end of the story. Why? Because most of our leaders or our presidents, they have absolute authority. And God did not want man to have absolute authority because he knows that man is going to abuse that authority. So that's why God divided the powers. But we, in our countries in Africa, we don't know that. We allow the president, the people who were drafting the constitution, somehow allow the president to have absolute power. And because of that, the president can do and undo. In most African countries, nothing happens without the consent of the president. He controls everything. He has absolute authority, and that is wrong. And when one person has that kind of authority, there is no way there will be no corruption in that nation. So if we want to fight corruption in Africa, that is one of the things that we have to rectify. That is one of the things that we have to correct in our constitution. There has to be absolute separation of powers and independence of these three branches. And these three branches must have constitutional powers to check the other branches. That is what is called balance. They are co-equal. But in most African countries, the presidency is high there. The other branches are below. In other countries in Africa, the president has the power to appoint judges and justices. So the president can use his appointment and dismissal powers, to threaten those people. That is why the people acquiesce. They listen. They follow the instruction of the president because the president has absolute authority. So because of this, that is why you see in most African countries, not all, there is rampant corruption. Because nobody can question the president. If you dare do it, you can disappear in the middle of the night. So everybody is afraid. And that is a recipe for corruption to strive in our nations, for corruption to grow in our nations. Most of our leaders, they go abroad. They spend government money anyhow. They don't care about the people because they have the powers. You see, in a country where you have division of powers, the parliament can bring in the president, question the ministers, or challenge the president, impeach the president. That happened in America recently. That's to show you that the American system, how these branches, they are co-equal. They are independent. They can check each other. There is balance in the system. Try that in Africa. You cannot. Why? Because the president has absolute power. Most of our presidents in Africa, they are kings. They are monarchs. They are dictators. They have absolute authority. There is no way you can question them. If you try that, your life is in danger. And these are some of the things why, Africa is where Africa is today. Because the president has absolute authority. He's the one that is, reigning and ruling. What he says is what goes. He has his boys. The military, they are behind him. He gives them a lot of money. And he uses them to also control, the people. When the people go out to peacefully protest, what happens? He sends the military. He sends the police. When somebody challenges the president, what does he do? You are arrested. But if we live in a democracy, where there is separation of powers and checks and balances, those kinds of things will not be rampant. The parliamentarians, they have the authority to check the president and his ministers. Even the judges, the justices, the case can come up and they will declare, the law that is unconstitutional. They will not listen. Sometimes even from what comes from the president, that the president should lock up somebody. But if these branches are separate and co-equal, the judges and the justices will not listen. But it's unfortunate that in most of our countries, there is no real separation of powers. The president has absolute authority. He's like a king, and that is wrong. We are living in a democracy. There's a difference between a kingdom and a democracy. In a kingdom, it is God. It's God that rules. Or if it's a secular kingdom, you have a king or a queen who rules. In the kingdom of God, God has absolute authority. He controls everything. But in a democracy, power belongs to the people. Democracy comes from the Greek word demos, which means, people, and kratia, which means power. So power belongs to the people. But in a kingdom, power resides upon the king. The king has absolute authority. But in a democracy, the president does not have absolute authority. The power of the state is divided into 3 co-equal branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary. So in such a country, at least, corruption will be at bay. Because the legislators, they have their own constitutional powers to check the president. The president also has constitutional powers to check the legislative branch. The president also has constitutional powers to check the justices of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court also, they have constitutional powers to check the president. The justices at the Supreme Court, they also have constitutional powers to check the legislators. So in a democracy like that, this only happens, mostly in the developed countries. That's why corruption is, it's not as rampant as it is in Africa, even though in the developed world also, there is serious corruption. We are human beings. So we are prone, we are selfish. So don't think that there is no corruption in the developed world. My God, in some of those countries, there is huge amount of corruption. Even with the separation of powers. Then just imagine in Africa, where in most countries there is no separation of power. The kind of corruption that is going on is mind-blowing. If we can have corruption in developed countries with the separation of powers, how much more in Africa? The corruption in Africa is huge. But we can reduce that corruption if people understand this doctrine of the separation of powers and checks and balances, and we put it in our constitution. Most countries in Africa have it, but there is no real separation. That's the point. The point is that even though they have the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the presidency, there is no real separation of powers. So we have to revisit our constitutions. If we want to reduce corruption in Africa, we have to revisit our constitutions. Our constitutions have to be rewritten so that we can put in place some of these ideas. Most of the people who are in government today, they go to our churches, they attend the mosques, but Christians don't know this idea. They just think that everything is about prayer and prayer and prayer. Prayer is important. Prayer can heal a land. But my dear brothers and sisters, the gospel of the kingdom is not just about prayers. The first pillar of the kingdom gospel is the transformation of the individual. Once the individual is transformed, God has now given us principles and values that are written in the Bible that we now have to use to bring economic prosperity, national transformation, societal transformation in our countries. So we need prayers. We also need good economic policies, good social policies, good political policies in order to bring prosperity in our nations. That's the new covenant. The new covenant does not only talk about the individual transformation. The new covenant also talks about the prosperity of the land. You see, we as Christians, we are short-sighted. One of the reasons is because we don't even understand the Bible that we are reading. You see, we think that when you give tithes and offering, that's the only way to get blessed. No! There are other ways that we as Christians can be blessed. You see, this is the same thing that the Pharisees and the scribes were doing. Matthew 23:23, Jesus rebuked them. You see, that you are concentrating only on tithes. It's the same thing today. People abuse senior pastors because of tithes and offerings. Jesus said you focus on those things. Don't neglect, don't fail to do them, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the law. The weightier matters of the law are things like justice, things like righteousness. That is where the gospel is. The gospel is about righteousness. The gospel is about justice. That is what we should be preaching. That is what brings transformation to the person and transformation, in our society. That is what brings development. See, in Africa, we are not preaching the right gospel. We are just focusing on one aspect of the gospel that does not even change the individual and does not change the society. You see, the gospel of the kingdom changes the individual and transforms the society. That is the power of the gospel of the kingdom. But many people don't understand this gospel. So we are talking about using the separation of powers doctrine to fight corruption in Africa. So if the branches of government in Africa are independent and separate, if the president does something, the Congress people have the right and the constitutional duty, to question the president. And if the president does something that is not good, the people can sue the president, Congress can sue the president, and the judge or the justices will be able to render justice. But you see, in Africa, it's practically impossible for people to do that. Why? Because the president has a lot of powers. The president can do and undo. This is why we as Christians, we have to teach our people, because the next generation, the leaders of the next generation, will come from our churches and from our mosques. Before I end this program, I just wanted to give you, just to apply this topic that we are talking about, the separation of powers and checks and balances. In Cameroon, the present-day Cameroon is made up of two independent territories that were United Nations trusteeship territories, French Cameroon and Southern Cameroons. French Cameroon got her independence in 1960, while Southern Cameroons was not yet independent. And there were discussions that happened at the UN, and then there was a plebiscite in 1961, 11 February 1961. So during that plebiscite, the Southern Cameroonians were given two questions. Do you want to join Nigeria, or do you want to join French Cameroon? And the people agreed to join French Cameroon. So in 1961, French Cameroon and Southern Cameroons, they joined together under a federal system of government. So, but before that happened, on 1st October 1961, there were negotiations that were going on between the leaders of Southern Cameroons and President Ahidjo of French Cameroon. And one of the things that happened was that they agreed on a document. And in that document, they agreed that they are going to reunite under a federal system. And in that federal system, the federal government will have limited subjects, while the rest of the subjects will be given to, by subject that means the things that the government will do. So there are about 8 or 9 items that the federal government was to do, and then the remaining subjects were given to the federated states. So that agreement gave the federated states autonomy from the federal government. So but during the negotiations, there was a particular meeting that took place in Boya. And during that meeting, Ahidjo was there, Foncha was there, Asala was there, and other leaders were there, and the cabinet members of Foncha, they were there in that meeting. And I think Ahidjo wanted something, and Foncha was not willing to give Ahidjo that issue. They were talking about, the security of Southern Cameroons. So there was a disagreement in that meeting, and Ahidjo was annoyed, and he left the meeting, and he did not come back. So that was an eye-opener to Foncha. But in spite of what Ahidjo did, Foncha still went ahead to continue the negotiations. You see, as a leader, you must have vision. The man did not see that Ahijo was, not a good leader. This is not the kind of person I should be, dealing with. At that time, Southern Cameroonians had the right to protest because they were a trust territory under the United Nations. So they were not yet, they were not yet part of French Cameroon. So they had every right to protest that they are not going to join French Cameroon. So Foncha understood the character of Ahijo, that he was a man of anger, a man who probably will not be a good politician. The sign was already there, but Foncha continued the discussion. And when they went to Fumban, the Southern Cameroonians, they had a meeting in Bamenda. And in that meeting, all the leaders, I think there were 51 of different parties, they agreed on a loose federation. Why? Because they wanted to have their own autonomy. And then when they went to Fumban for the final meeting, somehow Ahijo was able to play them. And they agreed on most of the things that Ahijo suggested. And then the final meeting took place in Yaoundé. And when the constitution came out, the result was that Ahijo had broad powers. He had unlimited powers. He had absolute powers. One of the things that was written in the constitution, Article 15, Section 1, is that Ahijo had emergency powers. When a president declares an emergency in a country, it means that the president is given additional powers. An emergency comes up when, there is terror, there is problem. And at that time, French Cameroon was undergoing political instability. There was terrorism in French Cameroon. So Ahijo made sure that he had that power written in the constitution. That was not all. In Article 50 of the 1961 Constitution, Federal Constitution, Ahijo also had the power to, make decrees. And those decrees were like laws. In a normal democracy, the way it works is that parliamentarians will come up with a bill and they will debate on that bill. And when the bill is signed or approved, they will now send that bill to the president. And then the president will now sign the bill. And then the bill will become law. So it is a bill that becomes law after the president signs it. So that is how it works in a normal democracy. But what Ahijo got during the negotiation was that for 6 months, he was going to rule by decree, which means that the decree that he signed had the power, or it was like equal to a law. So at the end of the day, Ahijo had absolute powers. He was more powerful than he came into the union. So because of his powers that he had, he was able to undermine the very constitution. And immediately, Southern Cameroons and French Cameroon reunited. Do you know what Ahijo did? Because of the broad powers that was given to him by the constitution, even though the country was a federal system, Ahijo now divided the country again into 6 sections, into 6 regions, and he appointed federal inspectors. And those federal inspectors were accountable to him. So in Southern Cameroon, which was one of the regions, he placed a federal inspector in Southern Cameroon and gave him enormous powers. So that federal inspector had powers to go after, state employees and the employees of the federal government. That federal inspector had the powers of the police. to help him to do his investigation. Remember, Southern Cameroon had a prime minister. So, and the prime minister of Southern Cameroon became the vice president of the nation. So even though Foncha was the vice president of the nation and the prime minister of Southern Cameroon, the federal inspector had his authority challenged that of Foncha. But that was not the original agreement. The situation became the way it became because of former President Amadou Ahidjo, who had absolute power. And just 1 year after reunification, Southern Cameroonians could no longer take it. So what did they do? They wrote a memorandum, a secret document, and sent it to Ahidjo complaining that they have been absorbed by the French. They are marginalized. So the issue of marginalization did not start today. It started from the very first day that French Cameroon united with Southern Cameroons. The reason I'm giving you this story is because Foncha was a Catholic Christian. Ndeli was a Presbyterian Christian. These people, they were our leaders, but they did not understand the doctrine of the separation of powers and checks and balances that is in the Bible. They were Christians, but they did not understand it. And because they did not understand it, Ahidjo was able to deceive them during the negotiations. And what is the result? Today in Southern Cameroons, thousands of Anglophones, they are in Nigeria as refugees. The result, the cause of that problem is the negotiations. Our leaders who were Christians, who did not understand the doctrine of the separation of powers, just like we have Christians today who don't understand even what I'm trying to talk about. How are we going to fight corruption in Africa when we don't even understand the doctrine of the separation of powers? It's one of the most powerful political tools that we can use in Africa to fight corruption. So Foncha, who was a Catholic Christian, did not understand the doctrine. Ndeli, who was a Presbyterian Christian, did not understand the doctrine, because if they did, they could not have accepted, Ahidjo to retain such absolute authority that Ahidjo now, because of the power that he had, he was using that power to oppress the Anglophones who willingly joined the French Cameroonians. And that is one of the causes of the problems, the conflict that we have today in Southern Cameroons. Many English-speaking Cameroonians have died because of what Foncha and Ndeli did. Many are refugees in Nigeria, suffering. Thank God for the Nigerian people who have opened their doors to accept our people because of what Foncha and Ndeli did. Many villages, over 300 villages in Southern Cameroon have been destroyed, have been burnt down by the military forces of French Cameroon. Because Foncha and Ndeli, who were Christians, they did not understand the doctrine of the separation of powers. Many of the women, many of the young girls have been raped because Ndeli and Foncha, who were Christians, who did not understand the doctrine of the separation of powers. Many Southern Cameroonians are in prison. They are languishing in pain and in suffering. Why? Because Ndeli and Foncha did not understand the doctrine of the separation of powers. These were Christian leaders. Just like we have Christians today who don't understand this. You see, prayer is important. But sometimes prayer will not solve the problem of corruption. God is a king. He has given us the ideas on how to fight corruption in the Bible. And one of those ideas is the principle of the separation of powers and checks and balances. So, we as Christians, our generation, we have failed. We are now appealing to the younger generation who will be leaders tomorrow to understand this doctrine, to understand this principle, that when a new constitution is drafted, you have to fight for this principle so that our people, can fight corruption in Africa. Just imagine the amount of wealth that is in Africa. The African countries, what do they not have? Cameroon is considered Africa in miniature, which means that there's everything you are looking for in Africa is in Cameroon. What a country. What a blessed country. But go there, see how the people are suffering because of the founding fathers who claimed to be Christians, but they did not understand the doctrine of the separation of powers. Why? Because the pastors, their leaders, did not teach them. They thought that Christianity is just going to church, sing and praise God and give your tithes and offering and you go back home. Look at the consequences of their ignorance of what has already been spelled out in the Bible. Could you imagine if these leaders insisted on the principle of separation of powers? The lives that have been lost, the properties that have been destroyed will not have been destroyed. We are suffering today, the people of Southern Cameroon are suffering today because Christians, Endeli, Foncha, who were Christians, who were supposed to understand the doctrine of the separation of powers and to fight for it, to put it in the constitution, did not understand the doctrine. And their descendants are suffering today. Their descendants are being killed today. Their descendants are running into the bushes. Their descendants are refugees in Nigeria. Their descendants are in prison in Cameroon. They are suffering today because Christians who were in leadership did not understand the doctrine of the separation of powers and checks and balances. People are dying today in Cameroon. Whereas God has given us these principles, these ideas to fight corruption, to fight the abuse of power. God does not want any person, a single person, to have all the authority. That is why he instituted the doctrine of the separation of powers. But in Cameroon, the president has absolute authority. Do you know what Ahidjo did? He did not only separate the Cameroon into 6 regions. In 1966, he abolished all the political parties in East Cameroon and in West Cameroon. And Cameroon had only a one-party system. This was a country that was, practicing multi-partyism. But because of the selfishness of former President Ahidjo, he abolished all the parties. He used his absolute authority and abolished all the parties. He called the party leaders and had a meeting with them and threatened them that they should go back and abolish their parties. And everybody said, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. They went. Today, look at the consequences. Because our people, they were Christians, but they did not understand the separation, the doctrine of the separation of powers. In 1972, what happened? Ahidjo changed the constitution of the country from a federal system of government into a unitary system of government. Why? Why was he able to do it? The constitution prohibited him. Section 47 of the 1961 constitution. That section prohibited the president or any other person to change the form of the state. But Ayijo went ahead and did it. Why? Because he had absolute power and nobody could challenge him. Even now, look at the people in Southern Cameroon, the Anglophones. They are dying in their numbers. They are suffering in their numbers. Nobody can stand up to challenge the president. Nobody can stand up to call the attention of the president. Even the prime minister, the leaders, the English-speaking leaders whose descendants, whose children are being raped, whose children are not going to school, whose children are suffering. These leaders cannot stand up for their people. The parliamentarians cannot even resign, all of them. Those who are in government, the prime minister, nobody can stand up and challenge the president or even talk to the president about the plight of the people. And most of those people, they are all Christians or Muslims. They go to churches. But look at the results that we have today. Everybody is there because of his own personal ambition, because of greed, because of selfishness. The Bible tells us about the doctrine of the separation of powers. Nobody can do it because the president has absolute authority. He has the military behind him. He has the power behind him. He can imprison people. He can kill his opponents. He can destroy their lives. So everybody is afraid. Anyone who stands up to challenge the president will finally run away from the country because his life will be threatened. Look at America, for example. The president was impeached. Why? Because there is separation of powers. Oh, my dear brothers and sisters, it is high time for Christians to understand politics. It is high time for Christians to understand the principles in the Bible. Sometimes we as Christians, we are suffering unnecessary pain for nothing. And sometimes we blame God. Even myself, I used to do that. But I had to, study to understand some of these things that I'm sharing with you. So I no longer blame God. You see, many people blame God for a lot of things. God is not responsible for some of the things that we blame him because he has already given us the ideas in the Bible, how we can transform our nation, how we can bring prosperity and national development in our nations. But yet, we still go to church and pray and dance and sing, and we are still broke. We don't have good roads in some of our countries in Africa. Look at a nation like Nigeria, very rich country, but they are still suffering with electricity. Look at Cameroon. I saw on Facebook, water, brown water coming up from the pipe. No pipe-borne water. What a disgrace. A country that has a lot of, wealth. We even have a sea. Water can be purified, but nobody has time. Our leaders don't have the power to bring in the ministers and question them. The reason is because there is no separation of powers. Everybody is afraid. Oh, my dear brothers and sisters, we have failed our generation. To those young Christians who are listening to me, get involved, understand politics and religion so that you will be able to bring transformation in your nation. You'll be able to bring transformation in your community. The gospel of the kingdom is not just about, the human person. Today we go to church. God bless me. God bless me. God prosper me. God heal me. God do that. God do this. God. It's all about me. It's good. But there is something that is better, which is the gospel of the kingdom. It talks about the transformation of our nations and society. That is the message. The message of the gospel of the kingdom talks about justice and righteousness. Until we get to that level of preaching, we have not started. Especially in Africa, our pastors are preaching the wrong messages. That's why our nation is the way it is. How could you imagine Endeli, Foncha? These were Christians, but they did not know the doctrine of the separation of powers. If they knew, Cameroon would not be in the situation in which Cameroon is right now. That nation will be flourishing. That nation will have a lot of investment. That nation will be, in great prosperity, because God has blessed that nation with everything. The soil is fertile. We have oil reserves. We have minerals. We have all kinds of blessing that God has blessed Cameroon with. But because of the bad leadership, look at how the people are suffering. Because of people who go to church, but they don't understand the Bible that they are reading. People are suffering as a result of that. Oh, my dear brothers and sisters, please share this message with your friends and family members. If you know somebody who is in politics, share this message with them. We are going to continue next week. Because of some commitments, I usually come up twice in a week. But now I'm going to be coming up just once in a week. And we are going to discuss the meaning and significance of the kingdom gospel. And then the next week we are going to discuss politics and Christianity. So please share this message. Leave your comments. And we are going to continue on Monday. Thank you so much for watching. Until Monday, bye-bye.